The Andes rise along the western edge of South America like a wall of stone and ice, stretching from Colombia to the southern tip of Chile. The range is ancient, cold, and indifferent. In certain valleys, snow persists year-round. The air thins above 10,000 feet. In October, spring arrives slowly. Storms can form without warning. Few people live at altitude. Fewer still survive crashes there. On the afternoon of the 12th of October 1972, a twin-engine Fairchild FH227D turboprop departed from Montevideo, Uruguay, carrying 45 people. The passengers were members of a rugby team from Stella Maris College, a Catholic school in Carrasco. Most were young men in their late teens or early 20s. Several mothers, siblings, and friends accompanied them. The destination was Santiago, Chile. The flight plan required crossing the Andes. Weather conditions were poor. The aircraft stopped briefly in Mendoza, Argentina, to refuel. Cloud cover over the mountains was heavy. The crew waited. The next day, October 13, conditions improved slightly. The pilots decided to proceed. The flight path followed a standard route through the Planchon Pass, a corridor between peaks. Visibility remained limited. The co-pilot, Lieutenant Colonel Dante Hector Lagrara, was unfamiliar with the terrain. The pilot, Colonel Julio Cesar Ferradas, had flown the route before but not recently. Air traffic control in Santiago provided navigational updates. At approximately 3:21 p.m., the crew reported passing Curicó, a town on the Chilean side of the Andes. They began their descent towards Santiago. The report was incorrect. They had not yet cleared the mountains. They were still deep within the range, surrounded by peaks exceeding 15,000 feet. At 3:30 p.m., the aircraft struck a ridgeline. The right wing sheared off first, then the tail section separated. The fuselage continued forward, tobogganing down a steep snow-covered slope before coming to rest at approximately 11,800 feet in a remote glacial valley between two mountains. The valley was unnamed. It was not near any road or settlement. The nearest village, Los Metenes, was more than 50 miles to the west, across multiple ridges. 12 people died on impact or within the first few hours. Others were seriously injured. The fuselage remained partially intact, though the rear of the aircraft was gone. Snow and wind entered freely. The temperature dropped rapidly after sunset. There were no rescue supplies, no medical equipment, no radio capable of transmission. The survivors, numbering 33 by nightfall, huddled together inside the wreckage. Most wore light clothing. Some had jackets. None had anticipated being stranded in sub-zero conditions. They found seat cushions, luggage, and a few bottles of wine. There was no food beyond a few chocolate bars and candies. The altitude made breathing difficult. Several passengers had fractured limbs. One, a young man named Arturo Noguera, had suffered severe internal injuries. He died during the night. The survivors included Roberto Canessa, a 19-year-old medical student, Nando Parado, whose mother and sister had died in the crash, Gustavo Zerbino, also a medical student, Antonio Tintin Vizintin, and Fernando Fito Strauch, who emerged as one of the group's informal leaders. Most had grown up in Montevideo in middle-class families. They were fit, disciplined by rugby, but unprepared for mountaineering or extended wilderness survival. None had training in alpine conditions. They assumed rescue would arrive quickly. On the first full day, October 14, they organized. They melted snow for water, using metal scraps and body heat. They rationed the small amount of food. They fashioned makeshift blankets from seat covers and insulation. The injured were moved to the warmest positions. The strongest took turns keeping watch. They heard aircraft overhead. They attempted to signal with reflective materials and by arranging luggage in patterns on the snow. The planes did not see them. The white fuselage blended into the surrounding snowfield. The valley was narrow and shadowed. Search patterns focused farther west, near Curicó, based on the last reported position. On October 17, an avalanche struck the fuselage during the night. Snow poured through the open rear. filling the interior within seconds. 8 more people died, suffocated under the weight. The survivors dug frantically in darkness. Some were pulled free, others were not. The group now numbered 19. Morale collapsed briefly. They were colder, weaker, and more isolated. The food was gone. The search flights had stopped. Radio reception via a small transistor radio salvaged from the wreckage confirmed that official rescue efforts had been suspended after 8 days. The authorities assumed no one had survived. The decision to consume the bodies of the dead was not immediate. It emerged gradually over several days, discussed in low voices, resisted, then accepted. Starvation was measurable. Muscle mass decreased. Movement slowed. Rational thought became harder. The bodies were preserved by the cold. Roberto Canessa and Gustavo Zerbino, both medical students, understood the physiology. Without protein, the body consumes itself. Death was certain otherwise. The group held a quiet meeting. Some prayed. A few refused initially. Others agreed immediately. By late October, all were participating. Flesh was cut in small portions, using glass shards from the cockpit windows. It was eaten raw. No one spoke during the process. There was no ceremony. It was mechanical, deliberate, and silent. The routine became systematic. Mornings began with melting snow. Water was collected in bottles and aluminum foil shaped into makeshift containers. Sunlight provided limited warmth. They moved seat cushions outside to dry. Injuries were inspected. Frostbite affected toes, fingers, and faces. Open wounds became infected. There were no antibiotics. Bandages were improvised from fabric torn from shirts. The group took turns venturing short distances from the fuselage to defecate and to search for luggage that had scattered during the crash. They found suitcases containing clothing, which they layered. They found sunglasses, which helped against snow blindness. They found a lipstick, used to prevent chapped lips. Sleep was irregular. Nights were long and bitterly cold. They slept pressed together, sharing body heat. Conversations were sparse. Some spoke of family, others remained silent. Religious faith was central to many. They recited prayers. They debated theology. They asked whether survival under these conditions constituted a sin. A few maintained that it did not, that life was sacred, that God would understand. Others were uncertain. The question was revisited frequently, but never definitively resolved. By mid-November, several group members began planning an escape. The valley offered no route to lower ground. The slopes were too steep, the snow too deep. The only option was to climb higher, cross the mountains, and descend the western side toward Chile. Nando Parrado was insistent. He had lost his mother and sister. He refused to wait for death. Roberto Canessa agreed. Antonio Vizintin volunteered as well. They prepared for weeks. They sewed a sleeping bag from insulation fabric. They fashioned crude snowshoes from seat cushions and wire. They accumulated small reserves of meat. They tested themselves on short climbs up the valley walls, struggling in the thin air. On December 12, 60 days after the crash, Parrado, Canessa, and Vizintin set out to the west. They carried minimal supplies. The sleeping bag was barely functional. They climbed for 3 days, ascending more than 4,000 vertical feet to the ridgeline. From the summit, they expected to see Chilean farmland. Instead, they saw only more mountains, range after range, extending to the horizon. The sight was devastating. They had assumed the crash site was near the Chilean border. It was not. They were deep in the interior. Vizintin, recognizing the impossibility, turned back. Parrado and Canessa continued west. They walked for 10 days. The terrain was brutal. They descended into valleys, then climbed again. They crossed glaciers. They waded through rivers. They slept in the open, sharing the sleeping bag. Their feet blistered, then bled. They had no map. They navigated by sun and intuition. They ate the last of their meat reserves by the 4th day. Afterward, they ate nothing. They drank snowmelt. Their bodies continued to weaken. Speech became difficult. They did not discuss failure. They simply moved forward, one step, then another. On December 20, they encountered vegetation, thin grasses, then shrubs, then trees. The altitude had dropped. The air thickened. They followed a river downstream. The next day, they saw signs of human activity, hoof prints, a cattle trail. Late in the afternoon, they spotted 3 men on horseback on the opposite bank of the river. The current was too loud for voices to carry. One of the horsemen, a Chilean farmer named Sergio Catalan, threw a message across, tied to a rock. Parado wrote a brief note in return, explaining the crash, the survivors, the location. Catalan read the note, nodded, and rode away. He returned the following morning with police. Parado and Canessa were evacuated by helicopter. The remaining 14 survivors were retrieved on December 22 and 23, 72 days after the crash. They were emaciated, frostbitten, and exhausted. Several required hospitalization for weeks. None had suffered permanent psychological incapacitation, though all carried the experience forward in silence for years. The revelation of cannibalism, disclosed during subsequent interviews, provoked international controversy. Some condemned the survivors, others defended them. The Catholic Church issued statements of understanding. Families of the deceased responded with a range of emotions: grief, acceptance, anger. The survivors themselves spoke little publicly for many years. The crash was attributed to pilot error. The crew had descended prematurely, misidentifying their position. The aircraft was not equipped with terrain radar. Visibility had been poor. The mistake was understandable but fatal. Investigations found no mechanical failure. The Fairchild had been airworthy. The story became widely known. Books were published. Films were made. The survivors gave occasional interviews but remained private individuals. Many returned to ordinary lives, medicine, engineering, business. They maintained close relationships with one another. Annual reunions were held. The memory of those who died was honored quietly. The Andes are unchanged. The valley where the fuselage came to rest remains remote. Debris is still visible during certain seasons. Climbers occasionally pass through. The cold persists. The snow returns each winter. The mountains do not record the events that occur within them. They simply remain. What endures from the incident is not the sensational detail, but the ordinary mechanics of survival: rationing, routine, discipline, hope maintained in increments, decisions made collectively under unbearable pressure, and the willingness to continue moving when continuation seemed impossible. The survivors did not perform heroism. They simply refused to stop. That refusal, sustained across 72 days, was sufficient. It had to be.